Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most massive, fundamental geopolitical shifts of our entire lifetime, which is the changing global balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. If you really want to understand how the world is actually functioning today and what the future holds for global security, you absolutely have to understand the rapidly evolving relationship between the United States, China, and the regional allies who are caught right in the middle of it all.
Okay, let's dive into this, which brings us to the core question of this briefing. For decades following the end of the Cold War, the U.S. was basically the undisputed heavyweight champion on the global stage. But the source material we're analyzing today points to a profound and undeniable shift. We're moving away from uncontested American primacy and diving headfirst into a highly contested, multipolar reality where multiple superpowers are actively vying for influence and control.
To help us navigate this complex web, here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the shift, move into the rivalry, take a look at the strategic map, zoom in for the micro-reality, and wrap up with the responses.
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the shift. We'll be looking at the end of primacy and the so-called Trump effect.
For a long time, U.S. foreign policy in Asia rested on a highly predictable bipartisan consensus. But recent years have marked a decisive structural break from that post-Cold War normal. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what analysts mean when they examine this distinct approach to foreign policy. They call it the upside-down duck. Imagine a duck gliding across a pond. On the surface, you've got chaotic sound and fury, unpredictable announcements, breaking of traditional diplomatic decorum. But below the waterline, the duck's legs are paddling steadily, representing career professionals quietly executing conventional policy. However, you can't just ignore the surface. That surface disruption introduced a highly transactional view of alliances, where traditional partnerships are suddenly viewed as strict cost-benefit equations rather than enduring expressions of shared values.
So how does this shift play out domestically? Well, if the U.S. wants to compete economically in this new multipolar world, experts argue it needs to invest heavily in research, development, and infrastructure to provide a credible alternative to China's economic model. But there's this massive bureaucratic inertia holding the U.S. back. A staggering 57% of U.S. discretionary spending is still swallowed up by the military and counterterrorism, leaving only 43% for literally everything else. This highlights a really critical vulnerability. The U.S. budget is struggling to pivot toward the diplomatic and commercial tools that are absolutely required for modern economic competition.
Moving on to Section 2, the rivalry. Let's talk about the evolving China challenge.
You know, the U.S. has officially labeled China a strategic competitor, but what we're really looking at here is a true peer competitor aiming to displace U.S. influence in the Indo-Pacific. American primacy is actively eroding, and China hasn't just been sitting idle. They now possess the largest navy in the world. They've also developed highly advanced anti-access area denial, or A2/AD, missile technology. We're talking about precision weapons like the DF-21D, which is often called the carrier killer, as well as hypersonic missiles. This technology means any potential U.S. military intervention in regional conflicts, say over Taiwan or the South China Sea, would now be unacceptably costly. Plus, China has achieved regional economic dominance, stepping in as an institutional entrepreneur through massive infrastructure networks like the Belt and Road Initiative.
So, with all this rising tension, are we just inevitably destined for a clash? Historically, analysts point to the Thucydides trap. That's the theory that conflict is almost a sure thing when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling one. But the reality of today's rivalry is actually defined by deep codependence. Unlike the total ideological and economic separation we saw during the Cold War, the U.S. and China are deeply integrated economically. While the U.S. might attempt decoupling in some highly sensitive technology sectors, a complete economic separation would absolutely devastate global growth. It's a fierce rivalry, sure, but it's wrapped in an incredibly complex economic embrace.
That brings us to Section 3, the strategic map. We're looking at situations of strength and weakness.
We've talked about the big picture, but looking practically at the Indo-Pacific region, the strategic map is completely bifurcated. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how clearly it maps out the actual geographic reality of military power. The U.S. has distinct situations of strength in places like Japan and South Korea, where they enjoy high levels of military interoperability. And that's backed by incredibly potent South Korean ground forces and top-tier Japanese anti-submarine capabilities. On the flip side, there are glaring situations of weakness, like Taiwan and the South China Sea. These locations are highly vulnerable simply due to their sheer proximity to the Chinese mainland, and the fact that fixed U.S. bases, like those in Guam, are now well within range of Chinese missiles.
Let's zoom in a bit for Section 4, the micro-reality. Specifically, Australia's strategic dilemma.
What does this grand strategic chess game mean for a specific ally caught right in the middle of it? Well, to understand Australia's evolving position, you really have to understand AUKUS Pillar I, which is the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines by Australia. Experts note this represents the single biggest leap in their military capability in history. But, as you might guess, this upgrade comes with a catch. Australia is increasingly offering its territory as a sort of continental gift to the United States. Because U.S. bases in places like Okinawa and Guam are highly vulnerable now, the U.S. is strategically dispersing its assets, shifting force posture down to northern and western Australia to project power from a much safer distance.
But wow, does that deepening integration come with some massive existential risks for Australia? First off, a high-value target profile. By hosting U.S. B-52 bombers and nuclear-powered subs, Australian military bases become prime, high-value targets for preemptive strikes in a conflict. Second, there's the nuclear dimension escalation. While there aren't nuclear weapons routinely stored there, hosting nuclear-capable assets could potentially draw Australia into a nuclear escalation if a rival seeks to demonstrate resolve by striking an ally's base rather than the U.S. mainland. And finally, complete loss of agency. Critics point out that this level of profound integration essentially diminishes Australian sovereignty, making it virtually impossible for the country to remain neutral if a war actually erupts between the US and China.
Finally, let's zoom back out for Section 5, the responses. We'll look at strategies for navigating this multipolar world.
Backing up to grand strategy, how are foreign policy experts and former leaders advising that allies navigate this highly volatile, multipolar world? If an ally finds themselves dealing with a highly transactional U.S. administration, former leaders actually recommend a very specific psychological playbook to protect their interests. First, stand up to bullies. Flattery is deemed pretty ineffective here. Only courteous firmness and projecting strength are respected. Second, direct negotiation. In these environments, standard bureaucratic channels are often bypassed, meaning success depends heavily on direct leader-to-leader deals. And third, maintain distance. Allies are strongly advised to avoid the appearance of subservience, mostly because transactional leaders often lose respect for those they feel they've easily suborned.
So, the crucial point is, what should the overarching diplomatic strategy be moving forward for the international community? Right now, experts are deeply divided between two main approaches. The first is the case for an ideological truce. This means essentially abandoning liberal universalism, which is the attempt to spread democracy through pressure, and instead establishing a long truce where both political systems acknowledge each other as legitimate. The goal there is a regional equilibrium based purely on mutual sovereignty. The second approach is deterrence. This view draws heavily on historical lessons from the 1930s, arguing that failing to arm democracies only emboldens autocracies. This camp believes you must project united, uncompromising military strength to deter any territorial aggression.
We'll end this explainer with a final provocative thought. In a contested multipolar world, how exactly do regional allies balance their historical and cultural loyalty with the inescapable material reality of their geography? The post-World War II order has shifted forever, and as the tectonic plates of global power continue to move, every single nation is going to have to recalculate its survival strategy. Thank you so much for joining me as we unpack this complex briefing today. Keep questioning, keep studying the data, and keep exploring how this new geopolitical reality is going to shape our future.